My name is Sophia Reed, and if you had asked me a year ago where my life was heading, I would have told you everything was just as it should be. At 33, I was living in Savannah, Georgia, and had carved out a fulfilling career as an event planner. My days were filled with creativity, my evenings with wonderful friends, and my marriage to Daniel seemed like the foundation of my perfect life. My parents, who had built their fortune from scratch, had given me every opportunity to create a stable and successful future. Losing them unexpectedly was a devastating blow. Their absence left a void in my life, one I couldn't imagine ever filling. But their final gift to me was extraordinary: their estate. A luxurious mansion worth $100 million. To say the mansion was magnificent would be an understatement. It wasn't just a house, it was a piece of my parents, a symbol of their hard work, love, and dreams. Every detail, from the grand staircase to the sprawling gardens, carried memories of them. Moving into the mansion wasn't just about living in luxury, it was about preserving their legacy. I saw it as a new chapter in my life, one where I could honor their memory. Daniel, my husband, was overjoyed about the mansion. At 35, Daniel had built a career as a real estate agent, and the idea of living in such an opulent home thrilled him. We spent weeks decorating and turning it into our dream house. It felt like life had finally aligned perfectly. We had peaceful evenings strolling through the garden, talking about our future, and imagining the possibilities ahead. But perfection is fragile. The cracks began to show sooner than I anticipated. From the moment Michelle, my mother-in-law, learned about the inheritance, things started to change. Michelle was a woman with a strong presence, a little too strong, if I'm being honest. She had always been critical, demanding, and unyielding, but I had managed to keep the peace for Daniel's sake. I thought I could handle her. I was wrong. When Michelle saw the mansion for the first time, she was polite enough, showering it with compliments. But there was something beneath the surface. Her interest in the house felt too sharp, her words a little too calculated. It wasn't long before her true intentions began to show. "You know, Sophia," she said one afternoon over tea, "a property like this is a rare opportunity. You could sell it and invest the money in something much more profitable. Real estate is a gold mine if you know how to use it." Her words felt like an icy wind blowing through the room. I set my cup down carefully, trying to keep my composure. "Michelle, this house isn't just property to me. It's my parents' legacy. Selling it isn't something I'm considering." She gave me a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I understand, Sophia. But think about it. You could set yourself up for life. Real estate, a smart business investment, the right property, it could change everything." Her insistence was unsettling. I tried to explain, calmly but firmly, that the mansion wasn't just about its value. It was a connection to my parents, a part of them I wasn't willing to part with. But Michelle didn't let it go. Every conversation circled back to the same topic: selling the house. She simply couldn't understand why I wouldn't seize what she saw as a golden opportunity. It wasn't just Michelle. Over time, I started noticing subtle shifts in Daniel's behavior. At first, he stayed quiet during our discussions, but his silence became heavier, almost accusatory. I began to wonder if he was starting to side with his mother. The thought was a quiet ache in my chest, but I tried to push it aside, convincing myself I was overthinking things. One day, everything came to a head. Michelle showed up at the mansion unannounced, dragging her younger son Brian along with her. Brian was 27 and shared his mother's sharp, impatient energy. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. Michelle's eyes were alight with determination, and Brian stood behind her, his expression cold and unreadable. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Michelle didn't waste a second. She marched into the living room as if she owned the place. "Sophia, I've had enough," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "This house is a waste. You need to sell it and use that money wisely. I'm tired of waiting for you to make the right decision." Her words struck me like a slap. I stood there, stunned. "Michelle, this house is not for sale," I replied, trying to stay calm. "This isn't about the money, it's about my parents' legacy. I can't just give it up because you think it's a waste. Her smile was colder than I'd ever seen. There was something dark in her eyes, a determination that sent a chill down my spine. You think you're the only one who deserves to benefit from this inheritance, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Do you really believe your parents would want you to hoard it?
No, Sophia.
It's time to let go. Before I could respond, Brian stepped forward. His gaze was unrelenting, and his words carried an edge I hadn't expected. Mom's right, he said. You're being stubborn. This could be a huge opportunity for all of us. Why hold on to something that just sits here, wasting away? Their words were like a vice tightening around me. I felt trapped, suffocated by their relentless pressure. But even as my stomach churned with anxiety, I stood my ground. This isn't about money, I said again, my voice firm despite the trembling in my hands. I'm not selling. This house is mine, and it means something to me. Michelle's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of frustration. Brian crossed his arms, his jaw tight with anger. I could feel the tension in the room rising, a storm brewing that I wasn't sure I could weather. As they left that day, slamming the door behind them, I stood in the silence of the mansion, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this wasn't the end of it. Michelle wouldn't give up, and Daniel's silence lingered in my mind like a shadow. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a battleground. Michelle's smile faltered, just for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Fine, she said, her voice dripping with disdain, but don't think I'll forget this. With those chilling words, she turned and left, Brian trailing behind her. As I stood in the silence of my front porch, a heavy feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't over. Deep down, I knew Michelle wasn't the type to accept defeat. I had no idea just how far she would go, but what came next would shatter everything I thought I knew about betrayal and the cost of standing my ground. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it. Maybe Michelle's pride had simply been wounded, and she'd move on once she had time to cool off. But that hope didn't last long. What happened next confirmed all of my worst fears. I wish I could say I was prepared, that I saw it coming. But I didn't. Not even close. It started as an ordinary afternoon. Daniel and I were still settling into life in the mansion, finding our rhythm in this grand, unfamiliar space. I was upstairs in my makeshift office, working on plans for an upcoming event, completely absorbed in my work. The house was quiet, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of peace. That peace shattered with a sudden, loud knock on the front door. My heart jumped. Michelle rarely showed up unannounced, and the last time we spoke, her tone made it clear she wasn't ready to let things go. I took a deep breath, hoping I was wrong, and went to answer the door. As I opened it, there she was, Michelle. Her face was flushed with anger, and she didn't even bother with a polite greeting. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past me into the house, her eyes scanning the mansion like she was assessing her prey. "What are you doing here, Michelle?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my nerves were on edge. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the porch and called out, "Brian?" I hadn't even noticed him lurking just out of sight, but there he was, stepping forward with an expression that mirrored his mother's determination. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a casual visit. They weren't here to talk. "What is this about?" I demanded, my voice rising with the unease that was quickly turning into dread. Michelle fixed me with a cold, unflinching stare. "Everything, Sophia," she said, her tone as sharp as a blade. "You've made a huge mistake by not listening to me. I gave you a chance, but now you're forcing my hand." Before I could ask what she meant, a loud, unmistakable sound came from behind me, the crackling of fire. I spun around, my heart pounding, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Flames were licking up the edges of the mansion's beautiful wooden porch, spreading rapidly. My gaze darted back to Michelle and Brian. In Brian's hand was a lighter, and he held it like a weapon, his face devoid of any remorse. "What are you doing?" I screamed, the horror and disbelief making my voice tremble. Michelle's expression was cold, calculated. "This is the only way, Sophia," she said, her tone almost indifferent. "You're not listening, so we'll make you." Panic surged through me as the fire began to grow, consuming the porch and threatening to spread to the rest of the house. My parents' legacy, their hard work, their sacrifice, their love, was being reduced to ashes right before my eyes. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of destruction. I tried to think, to act, but the weight of what was happening was almost paralyzing. My first instinct was to call for help, but I knew I needed more than that. Desperation took over. I dashed into the living room, grabbed my phone, and started recording the scene. My hands were trembling so badly that the footage was shaky, but I forced myself to keep going. In the background, my eyes landed on something that made my stomach twist. The security guard, the one who was supposed to protect the mansion, was tied to a chair, gagged and helpless. And then I saw Daniel, my husband. He stood there, frozen, watching the chaos unfold.
He wasn't stopping them. He wasn't helping me.
He was just there, his face a mask of indecision. It hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just a bystander. He was complicit. The one person I thought I could rely on, the man I had built my life with, was standing with them. Betrayal doesn't even begin to describe what I felt in that moment. Tears threatened to spill, but I blinked them back. I couldn't afford to fall apart.
Not now.
Gritting my teeth, I made a split-second decision. I ran to the back of the mansion, where our trained attack dogs were kept. If I couldn't rely on anyone else, I could count on them. I released the dogs and gave a sharp whistle. They bolted toward the front of the house, their barks loud and ferocious. Michelle and Brian's faces turned pale as they saw the dogs charging toward them. Without a word, they turned and ran, fleeing into the distance like the cowards they were. But the damage had already been done. The fire was spreading too quickly. I dialed 911 with shaking hands and shouted for help. The fire department arrived as fast as they could, but by the time the flames were extinguished, half the mansion was gone. The once grand estate, my parents' pride and joy, was now a smoldering ruin. I stood there, watching the devastation, struggling to process what had happened. This wasn't just an attack on a house. It was an attack on everything I held dear. And the worst part? Realizing that Daniel had stood by and let it happen. The man I loved had chosen his mother and brother over me, over our life, over everything we had built together. In the days that followed, the chaos only grew. I handed the video evidence over to the police, hoping it would be enough to hold Michelle and Brian accountable. But they were gone, disappeared without a trace, taking Daniel with them. My own husband had vanished, leaving me to pick up the pieces of the life they had tried to destroy. I thought I knew betrayal. I thought I understood loss. But nothing could have prepared me for this. And as I stood in the ruins of the mansion, the weight of it all pressing down on me, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I felt lost, heartbroken, angry. But one thing burned brighter than all the pain. I wouldn't let them get away with this. Not after everything they had destroyed. I had lost my parents' legacy, a piece of my identity, and the trust one had placed in people I thought were my family. I was determined to seek justice, not just for me, but for everything my parents had worked so hard to build. The first step was finding someone who could help me navigate this overwhelming situation. I hired Franklin Hayes, a lawyer with years of experience handling cases involving property disputes and fraud. From the moment I met him, I knew I had made the right choice. He was calm, professional, and empathetic. As I poured out my story, he listened patiently, nodding as I described the betrayal, the fire, and the evidence I had managed to gather. When I showed him the video footage of Michelle, Brian, and Daniel standing by as the fire consumed the mansion, Franklin's expression turned grim. "This is solid evidence," he said, his voice steady. "But we'll need more to make a strong case. If they're running from the law, we have to act quickly." His words were a sobering reminder of the uphill battle ahead. Together, we began gathering everything we could: photos, recordings, documents, anything that could link Michelle, Brian, and Daniel to the arson. It wasn't easy. Despite the police's efforts, they had vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of them. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. My own family, people I had trusted, had betrayed me and were now hiding from justice. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something worse. Every day, I scoured the news, hoping for some breakthrough. The mansion, once a symbol of love and family, now stood as a charred reminder of their cruelty. Visiting the ruins was agonizing, but I couldn't afford to dwell on my grief. There was something far more important at hand: justice. A week later, the call finally came. It was early morning when Franklin's number flashed on my phone. His voice, steady but urgent, carried the words I had been waiting to hear. "Sophia, they've been found. Your husband, mother-in-law, and brother-in-law were arrested this morning at the airport. They were trying to leave the country." For a moment, I was stunned. The weight of his words hit me like a wave. They had tried to run, to flee from the consequences of their actions. But they couldn't escape. The police had tracked them down just in time. Relief and anger swirled inside me, a volatile mix of emotions. This was my chance to make them pay for everything they had taken from me. The charges against them were severe: arson, conspiracy, property destruction, and more. I couldn't ignore Daniel's involvement. It was undeniable. The man I had trusted with my life had stood by as his family tried to destroy everything I held dear. It was a betrayal I couldn't fathom, but I didn't have the luxury of wallowing in self-pity. The trial loomed ahead, and I had to focus. The courtroom became a battleground, a place where every detail of that horrific day was laid bare. I testified about everything: how Michelle and Brian had set the fire, how I had captured the evidence on my phone, and how Daniel had stood there, complicit in their crime. They denied it, of course, but the evidence was irrefutable. Franklin presented the video footage, the photos, and the testimony of witnesses who had seen them at the mansion. Piece by piece, the case against them was built. Sitting in the courtroom, facing Daniel, Michelle, and Brian, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Their expressions ranged from defiance to feigned innocence, but I didn't let it intimidate me. I focused on the truth, on the justice my parents' legacy deserved. When the verdict was finally announced, a wave of relief washed over me. The court ruled in my favor. Daniel, Michelle, and Brian were ordered to sell their properties and compensate me for the loss of the mansion. But their punishment didn't end there. The court handed down prison sentences, forcing them to face the consequences of their greed and betrayal. They had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they had destroyed themselves. It should have felt like a victory. Justice had been served, and they were being held accountable. But as I walked out of the courtroom, I couldn't shake the bitterness lingering in my heart. Daniel, the man I had once loved and trusted, was now a stranger. My own family, the people who were supposed to stand by me, had turned against me. And the mansion, the beautiful home that had been my parents' pride and joy, was gone. It wasn't just bricks and mortar that I had lost. It was the symbol of everything they had worked for. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to find my footing. The closure I had hoped for didn't come easily. The betrayal ran too deep, the scars too raw. But as the days passed, I began to see things differently. Yes, I had lost so much.
But I had also survived.
I had stood strong in the face of betrayal and fought back with everything I had. I wasn't just a victim. I was someone who had reclaimed her life. The compensation money from the court ruling gave me a chance to start fresh. I didn't need another mansion. I didn't need to replace what had been lost. What I needed was to invest in myself. I threw myself into my career as an event planner, a passion I had neglected during the chaos of the past months. For too long, my life had been consumed by the drama surrounding the inheritance. Now, I focused on what I loved, creating unforgettable experiences for others. I assembled a new team and took on some of the most exciting projects of my career. Planning weddings, corporate events, and celebrations reminded me of the joy in life, of the beauty in bringing people together. Beyond my work, I began to rebuild myself. I found solace in small, meaningful moments: morning walks, quiet evenings with friends, and the simple pleasure of knowing I had overcome something so devastating. The mansion may have been destroyed, but my parents' legacy wasn't. It lived on in me, in my strength, in my determination to honor them by moving forward. Reclaiming my life wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I had lost so much, but I had gained something even more valuable: the knowledge that I could survive anything. Healing wasn't immediate. It was a slow, deliberate journey. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to find pieces of myself I thought I'd lost forever. The chaos and betrayal had shaken me to my core, but they hadn't destroyed me. I knew I had to rebuild, not just my life, but my spirit. I surrounded myself with people who truly cared about me. My friends, those who had stood by me during the darkest moments, became my anchor. They reminded me of who I was before the chaos: strong, independent, and full of life. With their encouragement, I started to reconnect with old friends and even made new ones. Through these connections, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal and pain. I didn't forget the hurt. The pain lingered, a quiet echo of everything I had endured. But instead of letting it consume me, I learned to live with it. My parents had taught me about resilience, about standing tall no matter what life threw my way. Those lessons became the foundation of my recovery. I wasn't just healing, I was growing stronger. The mansion may have been destroyed, but I began to understand something important. It wasn't the house that defined me. It wasn't the grandeur or the memories it held. What defined me was my strength, my ability to rise from the ashes, and my determination to move forward. The house had been a symbol, but symbols could be rebuilt. My spirit couldn't be replaced, and I refused to let it be broken. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new, modest apartment, I felt a sense of peace wash over me for the first time in what felt like forever. The city skyline stretched out before me, bathed in the warm hues of a setting sun. Shades of orange and pink painted the horizon, and for the first time, I felt truly present. The chaos of the past no longer loomed over me like a storm cloud. I reflected on everything I had lost: my parents, the mansion, and the trust one had once placed in people I loved. But I also thought about what I had gained. The pain, though unbearable at times, had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience and self-worth. The betrayal had tested me, but it had also revealed a strength I didn't know I had. The people who had hurt me, Daniel, Michelle, and Brian, were no longer a part of my life. They were paying the price for their actions, facing the consequences of their choices. And while their betrayal had once filled me with anger, that anger no longer defined me. Instead, I felt freedom. I was free from their manipulations, their greed, and their lies. Free from the suffocating weight of their betrayal. For so long, their actions had controlled my narrative, but not anymore. I was in control now. My story was mine to write, and I would write it on my own terms. I began to see the past not as a burden, but as a source of strength. The memories of my parents, though bittersweet, became my guiding light. They had built their lives on hard work, integrity, and love, and I decided to honor them by building my future on those same principles. I didn't need another mansion to feel secure. I didn't need to replace what was lost. What I needed was to create a life that reflected my values and dreams. I threw myself into my work, pouring my heart and soul into my career as an event planner. It was a passion I had always cherished, and it gave me purpose. Helping others celebrate their milestones reminded me of the beauty in life, the joy in creating memories. Beyond work, I focused on finding joy in the small things. Morning walks through the park, evenings spent laughing with friends, quiet moments of reflection. Each one felt like a gift. The simple pleasures I had once taken for granted now felt profound. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, I realized something powerful. I had survived. I had faced betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, and I had come out stronger. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it.
I was no longer weighed down by the past.
I was lighter, freer, and more confident than I had ever been. This was my new beginning, a fresh start. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it with open arms. Life would undoubtedly bring new challenges, but I was no longer afraid. I had proven to myself that no matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how great the loss, I had the strength to rise above it. Looking out at the vibrant city lights, I felt a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I had learned, for the people who had supported me, and for the inner strength that had carried me through the darkest days. My story wasn't over, it was just beginning, and I was ready to live it fully on my own terms.